People often say revenge is pointless, a hollow victory that only leaves you feeling worse in the end. But honestly, I'm not sure I believe that. I got back at my wife and I ruined her career. Do I feel guilty? Maybe, but not as much as I probably should. It gave me a sense of control, like I finally reclaimed something she took from me without even realizing it. But before we dive into all that, let me take you back to the beginning. You need to know how everything unfolded, how it all led to this moment. I'm just an average guy, a baker. It's not the flashiest job, but it's something I've always loved. There's something special about kneading dough, feeling it come together just right, and smelling freshly baked bread straight out of the oven. It's deeply satisfying. For years, I've dreamed of owning my own bakery, but I never had the courage to go for it. There was always too much at stake: money, staff, rent, and of course, the fear of failure. That fear alone was enough to keep me from taking the leap. So I stayed where I was, working in someone else's bakery, doing my job while my dream of owning a place of my own stayed on the back burner. My wife, on the other hand, was nothing like me. She was always reaching for the next big thing. She worked as a director in a prestigious corporation, one of those jobs where people wear expensive suits and sit in glass offices all day. She led teams, managed projects, and handled tasks that I didn't really understand. But her job paid well, very well. And before you ask, no, her higher salary didn't bother me. At least, not at first. Sure, we were different, but I loved her. Back then, her corporate success didn't clash with my life in the bakery. I admired her ambition and drive. In those early days, her demanding career didn't interfere with our relationship. Despite her heavy workload, we found time for each other. I never imagined that her success would become a wedge between us. If anything, I was proud of her. She was a powerhouse, and I admired her for that. But over time, things started to shift. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like a tiny leak that eventually became a flood. She began staying late at work more often. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her job was important, and I didn't want to be the husband who complained about her working hard. Then the business trip started. There was always another meeting, another conference, another urgent task pulling her away. When she was home, it felt like she wasn't really there. She seemed distant, emotionally disconnected, even when she was sitting right next to me. I remember the first time I truly noticed it. We were on the couch watching a movie, I don't even remember which one, but instead of cuddling up with me like she used to, she was glued to her phone. I tried asking her about her day, but she gave me short, dismissive answers, like I was an afterthought. Something felt off, but I brushed it aside. I told myself she was just tired, stressed from work. Nothing more. But it didn't stop. It got worse. When I'd ask about her day, she'd snap at me, claiming she was too exhausted to talk. She started coming home late more frequently, sometimes smelling of perfume I didn't recognize. She never offered an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. How could I? She was the one earning most of the money, covering the bills, keeping us afloat. Accusing her of anything felt like biting the hand that fed us. So, I swallowed my suspicions and kept quiet. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right, and by the time I finally admitted it to myself, I barely recognized the woman I had married. Then one night, or rather early morning, everything came crashing down. It was around 3 a.m. and I was half asleep when her phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand, waking me up. Normally I wouldn't have cared, but for some reason, this time I did. I reached over, picked up her phone, and saw a text message. The screen lit up just enough for me to read a name I didn't recognize, followed by a heart emoji and the words, "Can't wait to see you again." I froze. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. This couldn't be real. But it was. My heart started pounding so loudly I thought it might wake her. My hands trembled as I held her phone. I tried to unlock it, desperate to see the rest of the message. but the password had been changed. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't some innocent misunderstanding. She was hiding something, and I had just stumbled upon it. I sat there in the dark, her phone in my hands, my mind racing. I could hear her soft breathing beside me, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. That was the moment everything clicked. The late nights, the endless business trips, the emotional distance. It all made sense now, and in that moment I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. People say revenge doesn't fix anything, but I was determined to find out. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The heart emoji, the message. It was too real to ignore. I didn't sleep after that, but I waited until she woke up. As she stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her hair, I decided it was time. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my mind was racing. "I saw something strange on your phone last night." She looked at me through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked, not stopping what she was doing. "There was a text at 3 a.m., I replied, watching her closely, from someone with a heart emoji. I waited, searching for any sign of guilt, a crack in her calm demeanor. But there was nothing. She blinked and said flatly, a heart emoji. "Yeah," I said, pressing on. "From one of your coworkers, I think. Can I see your phone?" I asked, holding my breath, as she stared at me like I'd completely lost my mind. Without a word, she unlocked her phone and handed it to me. I hesitated briefly, half expecting her to snatch it back at the last moment. But she didn't. I opened her messages and scrolled to find the conversation I'd seen earlier that night. To my surprise, there was nothing. The thread was completely empty. Frowning, I scrolled again, faster this time. Where was it? I knew what I'd seen. Looking up at her, I caught her raising an eyebrow, her expression calm and composed. "Maybe someone sent it by accident and then deleted it," she said with a shrug, as if that was the simplest explanation. "You know how people do that, right? Send a text to the wrong person and then it disappears." She smiled, but it wasn't genuine. It was the kind of smile you give when someone says something absurd, and you're just humoring them. She made me feel ridiculous, like I was overreacting to nothing. I opened my mouth to argue, but quickly shut it. What could I say? The message was gone, and I had no proof. She took her phone back, slipped it into her bag, and gave me a look that screamed impatience. "Anything else? Are we done here? I've got work," she said. I shook my head, feeling like I'd just lost an invisible battle. "No, that's it," I mumbled. "Good," she replied, planting a quick kiss on my cheek like nothing had happened before walking out the door. I stood there for a moment, trying to process everything. Maybe she was right. Maybe someone really had sent the message by mistake and deleted it. Or maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, something didn't sit right. That feeling in my gut nagged at me, whispering that I was missing something, that she was playing me somehow. Still, I buried it, telling myself I was being paranoid, overthinking things. Later that day, I decided I owed her an apology. I had accused her first thing in the morning, and she had stayed calm, even reasonable. Maybe I was just being too suspicious. To make amends, I sent her a text suggesting we go out for dinner somewhere nice, a way to apologize without explicitly saying it. She replied quickly, "I can't. I've got too much work tonight. Maybe another time." I didn't think much of it. She worked late often. This wasn't unusual. I told her we could plan something for the weekend instead, but by evening, I still couldn't shake that nagging feeling. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. To clear my head, I decided to go for a walk. I wandered aimlessly, trying to sort through my thoughts. My wife hadn't come home yet, which wasn't surprising since she said she'd be working late. I had no reason not to believe her. But as I walked past a nice restaurant downtown, something stopped me in my tracks. There she was, sitting at a table, laughing and smiling. Across from her sat one of her colleagues, a director from her company, someone I'd met briefly a couple of times. They looked far too comfortable for a work dinner. I froze on the sidewalk, staring through the glass like an idiot. My heart pounded, the same thundering rhythm I'd felt the night before. My mind raced, scrambling for a logical explanation. She had said she was working late. Could this be part of it? A work meeting, perhaps? Pulling out my phone, I called her. It rang twice before she answered. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are you?" "I'm still at work," she replied casually, as if she wasn't lying through her teeth. "Just having dinner with some colleagues." "Why?" I clenched my teeth. "You sure it's just work?" Her tone turned sharp. "Jesus, why are you so suspicious lately? I told you I'm having dinner with colleagues. You really need to relax. You're starting to sound paranoid." Her words stung. Was I overreacting? Blowing things out of proportion? Maybe I was just insecure and it was showing. "Sorry," I muttered, feeling small. I didn't mean to." "No, you did," she interrupted. "You're being way too suspicious. Look, I have work to do. Stop calling me every 5 minutes like some needy teenager." Then she hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling like I'd been slapped. I looked back through the restaurant window. She and her colleague were still talking, still laughing. For a moment, guilt washed over me, guilt for doubting her, for thinking she might be cheating. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Work dinners happen all the time, right? I shoved my phone into my pocket and walked home, my head down. But I was so wrong. A couple of weeks later, my wife mentioned a corporate party her company was hosting. It was nothing major, just a small Friday night gathering with her colleagues. Normally, I avoided these events like the plague. Too many people pretending to enjoy themselves while talking about work. But after everything that had happened, I felt like I needed to go. Maybe attending would ease my doubts and help me put my suspicions to rest. I agreed, thinking it might smooth things over and make me feel better about everything. Meanwhile, work at the bakery was going smoothly. A new girl had recently joined the team. She was bright, cheerful, and always smiling. We often chatted, but it was nothing inappropriate, just friendly conversation. She didn't know I was married, and I hadn't mentioned it. I don't wear my ring at work because it gets in the way, and the topic never came up. I guess a part of me liked being seen as just me, not as the married guy. But she isn't really part of this story yet. Let's get back to the party. That Friday night, we arrived separately. My wife had left work early to help with the setup, while I finished my shift at the bakery and showed up later. By the time I arrived, the party was already in full swing. People were chatting, drinks were flowing, and music filled the air. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. My wife was mingling with her colleagues, while I hung around the bar, making small talk with people I barely knew. It wasn't the best night, but it wasn't awful either. I figured if I could get through it without any drama, I'd call it a win. Then at some point, I spotted her across the room. She was standing with the same man, her colleague, the one I'd seen her having dinner with before. The sight of them together made something inside me snap. I observed them intently, noticing how they stood too close, speaking in hushed tones like they were sharing a secret. That familiar sinking feeling returned to the pit of my stomach, and I realized I needed to get closer. I wasn't planning to confront them in front of everyone, but I had to hear what they were discussing. I needed to confirm whether my instincts were right or if I was simply imagining things. It wasn't difficult to approach without drawing attention. The room was crowded with people constantly moving, so I blended in with the party's flow, keeping my focus locked on them. I made sure they didn't notice me as I got close enough to overhear their conversation. Then it happened. The words I had dreaded to hear. "You need to leave him," her colleague said. in a low but unmistakable voice. "It's time. You deserve better than this. Kick him out of the house, make it official, and we can finally be together without hiding." My blood turned to ice. I froze, unable to move, my mind racing to comprehend what I'd just heard. My wife didn't speak at first. She simply nodded, as though the decision had already been made. Then, in a voice colder than I thought possible, she said, "I know. It's just the timing. I need to make sure everything is in place before I make my move." Her words hit me like a blow. Make her move? Like I was nothing more than an inconvenience she could discard when it suited her. My heart pounded fiercely in my chest. Thump, thump, thump. But this time there was no confusion, only searing anger. All my suspicions had been confirmed. This wasn't paranoia or baseless doubt. I had heard it straight from their mouths. They were plotting, planning to remove me from the equation so they could be together without shame or consequences. And all this time, I had been the one made to feel paranoid, the fool, while she betrayed me. But I didn't confront them then and there. Not yet. I stood rooted to the spot, silently watching, listening. If they thought they could scheme behind my back, I would do the same. There was no point in causing a scene. They thought they were operating in secret, but I would prove them wrong. Slowly, I backed away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving the party early without saying goodbye to anyone. I walked out the door, my mind racing, already planning my next steps. That night, all I could think about was what I had overheard, my wife plotting to throw me out like I meant nothing. The anger simmered inside me, but I knew I had to stay composed. I couldn't let my emotions explode. Not yet. I needed to play this smart. I spent days running scenarios through my mind, calculating every move. If I wanted to get back at her, I needed to strike where it would hurt the most. Her career. I wasn't going to let her and her sleazy colleague waltz off into their happily ever after while I was left in ruins. I needed to make sure she lost everything, just as she had planned for me. That's when my plan started to take shape. I knew about one of her company's competitors, a persistent firm that had been trying for years to gain market share, but had never quite succeeded. I figured if I could provide them with inside information, sensitive data about her company, it would be enough to shake things up. Maybe even cost her the career she had worked so hard to build. But the question was, how would I get the information? Her phone was locked with a new password, but her laptop was a different story. She often worked from home, but on weekends, her laptop usually sat untouched in the living room, gathering dust. I'd seen her use it enough to know it contained everything: emails, files, presentations, everything I needed. The laptop was the key to her professional life. All I had to do was get my hands on it without her noticing. So I waited patiently for the right opportunity. Then, one Saturday, the moment came. It was a typical lazy weekend. She was lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely absorbed. Casually, I mentioned an upcoming business trip. "Hey, I've got work tomorrow. I'll be back the next day," I said nonchalantly. She barely looked up. "Okay, cool," she replied, still focused on her screen. She didn't ask any questions or seem remotely interested, which made it easier. Her indifference worked in my favor. She was so wrapped up in her own world that she didn't even notice me packing my bag or slipping her laptop into it along with my clothes. She never used the laptop on weekends, so I knew she wouldn't miss it for a day. I left the house, got in my car, and drove straight to a service center. I wasn't a tech expert, so I needed help with the next step. I told the technician that I wanted everything backed up from the laptop: work files, emails, anything important. He didn't ask questions or seem suspicious. As far as he was concerned, it was my laptop and I was paying for the service. An hour later, I walked out with a complete copy of her digital life. Emails, work documents, confidential files. It was all there, the kind of information that, in the wrong hands, could bring her company to its knees. I didn't bother going through the files myself. I didn't care about her personal life. My focus was entirely on her career. Once I had what I needed, I drove home, outwardly calm but buzzing with excitement inside. I returned the laptop to its usual spot, ensuring it looked untouched. She was still sprawled on the couch, oblivious to the fact that her entire professional life was now in my possession. I kissed her on the forehead, acting as though it were just another day, and went about my evening like nothing had happened. Inside, though, I felt powerful. She had no idea that while she and her colleague were scheming, I was already several steps ahead of her. My next question was how to play my cards. Ever since overhearing their conversation at the party, I'd been consumed with plotting her downfall. Destroying her career was my goal, but I had to be cautious. No one could trace this back to me. It needed to hit her in a way that would ripple through her entire life. After some time, I identified the perfect target, a man from one of her company's biggest competitors. He wasn't high-ranking, but he was well-connected, and that was enough to set my plan in motion. His company was desperate for an edge over hers, and I now had exactly what they needed: insider information, directly from her laptop. I approached him cautiously, careful not to reveal too much too soon. When we finally met, I skipped the small talk and got straight to business. I presented him with confidential files, documents that could cause serious disruption at her company, but I wasn't handing them over for free. I named my price, and it was steep enough to ensure my financial security for a long time. He hesitated at first, saying it was too risky and that he couldn't pay such a large sum at her referral as a large time. He hesitated at first, saying it was too risky and that he couldn't pay such a large sum without verifying the data. I had anticipated this reaction, so I offered to let him inspect the files. However, I wasn't about to compromise my anonymity. I needed to ensure everything stayed clean and untraceable. To keep things simple, I wore a basic protective mask, not flashy, but enough to obscure my identity. We arranged to meet in an isolated parking lot, far from any prying eyes. The setting felt like a scene straight out of a crime thriller, the kind of place where shady deals unfold. I arrived with a portable hard drive tucked discreetly under my jacket. He was already there, leaning against his car, visibly nervous. Without a word, I handed him the drive and he connected it to his laptop. I stood a few steps back, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched him. Each second stretched into an eternity as his face was illuminated by the laptop's glow. He didn't speak, just scrolled through the files. Emails, private reports, financial documents, everything that could ruin her and her company. After what felt like half an hour, he finally looked up at me. I could see the greed in his eyes as he said, "This is good," nodding in approval. "It's worth the money." I nodded back but wasn't finished. There was one more condition I needed to ensure everything went as I planned. "When this comes to light," I said evenly, "the story needs to be that my wife leaked the data. She's the one who gave it to you." He paused briefly, probably weighing the risks, then shrugged. "Fine, no problem," he said. "Make it personal." To drive the point home, I handed him a matchbook with her name written on it. It was a small gesture, but its meaning was clear. When the scandal broke, she would take the blame, and no one would ever trace it back to me. We exchanged the cash, and the weight of it in my hands was tangible, a physical symbol of the chaos I was about to unleash. As I walked away from the parking lot, adrenaline coursed through me. This wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing her world was about to collapse, just as she had intended to do to mine. When I got home, I hid the money in a place she'd never think to look. She was too engrossed in her phone to even notice I'd been gone. Another piece of the puzzle was in place, another step toward my goal. But I had no idea just how much further things would spiral for her. The next morning, everything appeared normal. I went to work as if it were an ordinary day, but inside, I felt completely different. For the first time in a long while, I felt in control, and it felt good. At work, I spent a lot of time talking to the new girl. She was lively and full of energy, the kind of person who made the world feel lighter. We laughed about little things, and for the first time in ages, I felt like I could just be myself. By the end of the day, she asked if I'd like to grab coffee. I hesitated briefly, but then decided, why not? I needed a distraction, something to take my mind off the storm brewing at home. We ended up at a small, cozy cafe near work. It was the kind of place where you could relax and forget your troubles for a while. We drank coffee, talked, and laughed, and for once, I felt free of drama and betrayal. It was just two people enjoying each other's company. As we finished, she asked if I'd walk her home. I agreed, and as we wandered through the cool evening streets, the conversation grew quieter and more personal. When we reached her building, she stopped and turned to me. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her eyes asking a question I knew all too well. I hesitated. This was a boundary I hadn't crossed before, not even after everything my wife had done. But the moment felt inevitable, as though everything had been leading to this. Instead of stepping inside, I stopped and decided to be honest. "I need to tell you something," I said quietly. "I'm married." Her eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't interrupt. I told her everything. The affair, the betrayal, and the revenge I had set in motion. I didn't leave anything out. I half expected her to send me away, but she just nodded, taking it all in. After a long pause, she went to the kitchen and returned with a bottle of whiskey. "Whiskey?" I asked, surprised. "I thought you liked wine." She gave a small, humorous smile. "After hearing your story, wine doesn't cut it." We sat together, sipping our drinks in silence as the tension grew. At some point, the space between us seemed to vanish. I don't even remember how it happened, but before I knew it, we were in bed together. It wasn't planned or calculated. It just felt inevitable. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't, and I didn't feel guilty about it. My wife didn't call or text. She was too preoccupied with the disaster unfolding at work. Her career was falling apart, and she didn't have time to wonder where I was. That suited me just fine. When I finally returned home after staying at my colleague's place, I knew it was time to confront everything. The slow unraveling had reached its breaking point. As I walked through the door, I half expected her to be packing her things or pretending everything was fine, but no, she was waiting for me. The moment I stepped inside, she exploded. You've ruined everything," she screamed, her face contorted with rage. "Do you even understand what you've done? My career is over. I'm a joke at work, and it's all because of you." I stood there, absorbing her words, knowing there was no point in arguing. She was spiraling, and I wasn't going to waste my breath defending myself. Her voice grew louder with every accusation. "You've always been a nobody. Just some loser who's never amounted to anything, and now you've dragged me down with you. You've destroyed everything I've worked for." Her words hit harder than I expected. Despite everything, a small part of me still cared. Clenching my fists, I took a deep breath and said the words I'd been holding back for so long. "I think it's time we get a divorce." For a moment, she froze. Shock flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by a bitter laugh, cold and sharp, sending a chill through me. "A divorce? That's hilarious," she sneered. "You think you can just walk away from this after everything you've done?" I nodded firmly. "Yes, because I'm done. Done with you, done with all of it." The silence that followed was suffocating. She stood there, glaring at me with pure hatred, her chest rising and falling as she searched for something to say, but there was nothing left. We both knew it was over. Without another word, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The decision had already been made. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I had expected. There wasn't much to dispute. She was too caught up in the chaos of her collapsing career to care about anything else, and I was too emotionally drained to fight for more than my freedom. As the remnants of our marriage crumbled, something surprising began to grow. I started spending more time with my colleague, the one who had been there for me through everything. We didn't rush into anything, but there was a connection. It felt natural, easy, a welcome contrast to the constant tension that had dominated my old life. For the first time, I gathered the courage to do something I'd always dreamed of. I bought the bakery where I had been working for years. It was mine now. No more punching a time clock for someone else. No more fear of failure holding me back. It was a massive step, and it felt amazing. For the first time in a long while, I was creating something for myself. My life began to change in ways I hadn't anticipated. My new relationship was thriving. We laughed together, enjoyed each other's company, and everything felt effortless. I could finally breathe again, unburdened by the weight of the past. The cruel words my ex had hurled at me about being a failure, someone who would never achieve anything, still echoed in my mind sometimes, but they no longer carried weight. They felt empty now. I had built something meaningful, something she would never understand. I didn't bother keeping tabs on her downfall. I heard bits and pieces, rumors about her worsening situation at work, but I didn't care enough to dig deeper. She was dealing with the consequences of her own actions, and I was too busy living my own life to give it much thought. A year has passed since everything fell apart, and honestly, I never thought I'd be where I am now. After everything I went through, I couldn't imagine ever taking another chance on love, but life has a way of surprising you. I'm remarried now to the colleague who stood by me through it all. She's been my rock, my support, and I couldn't have asked for a better partner. And here's the best part. She's pregnant. We found out a few months ago, and now we're preparing to welcome a baby into our lives. It still feels surreal, but with each passing day, it becomes more real. I'm excited, nervous, and above all, grateful. The bakery has exceeded my expectations. After buying it, I poured everything I had into making it succeed, and the hard work has paid off. The business is thriving, and I've even had to hire extra help to keep up with the demand. It's still demanding work, but it's fulfilling in a way I never thought possible. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much my life has transformed in just 1 year. A year ago, I was at my lowest point. Now I've built something real for myself. My ex is out of my life for good, and I've completely moved on. I've let go of the anger and resentment that used to weigh me down. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who followed my journey, who offered advice, encouragement, or kind words. You have no idea how much it helped me during the darkest times. Reading your comments, knowing that people cared, it made all the difference. Thank you. Here's to fresh starts, brighter days, and a future full of possibilities.